June 22, 1943. Paris. Midnight hung heavy over the city, broken only by the distant hum of patrol cars and the echo of boots on cobblestones. Inside a cramped apartment near Montmartre, a young woman knelt on the wooden floor, sliding a small radio transmitter beneath a loose plank. The machine still radiated warmth from her last transmission, a coded message sent across the channel to London. Her fingers trembled as she tucked the final sheet of cipher paper into her skirt pocket. The pounding on the door began without warning, 3 sharp blows that rattled the frame. Outside, a voice barked in German, demanding entry. "The Gestapo!" She froze, heartbeat racing. In that suspended moment, the war pressed into a single choice: burn the codes or bluff her way out. Her hand hovered near the matches. If she destroyed the evidence, London would lose vital intelligence on German troop movements. If she kept them, discovery meant torture at Fresnes prison and execution at dawn. The pounding grew louder. A neighbor's window creaked open. No one dared intervene. She straightened, smoothing her dress, forcing calm into her features. Opening the door a crack, she faced 2 men in leather coats, their eyes sharp, scanning for signs of guilt. One stepped inside, brushing past her. The other lingered at the threshold, watching. A tin of bread sat on the table. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove. She spoke softly, in rehearsed indifference, explaining that she had been preparing a late meal. The Gestapo man moved toward the bedroom. Her chest tightened. Just beneath the floorboards lay the transmitter. Her lifeline to London. Her death sentence if found. The seconds stretched like hours. At last, the officer returned, shaking his head. No evidence. The men exchanged a glance, muttered a warning about curfew, and withdrew into the Paris night. The door shut, leaving silence. She collapsed against the wall, every nerve aflame. The radio remained hidden. The mission lived another day. For women like her, couriers, radio operators, saboteurs, such nights defined their war. They carried forged papers, whispered passwords in crowded cafes, and pedaled through occupied streets with messages sewn into hems or tucked inside bicycle handlebars. They were daughters, wives, and secretaries by daylight. By night, they became lifelines of intelligence, threading the fractured map of resistance across occupied Europe. The Gestapo dismissed them as harmless, a blind spot born of arrogance and ideology. Yet these women manipulated that underestimation into their sharpest weapon. Ordinary appearances masked extraordinary danger. A coded sentence slipped in a cafe could redirect an air raid. A forged train schedule could delay German reinforcements by days. London's Special Operations Executive depended on their nerve. Each transmission carried the pulse of battlefronts hundreds of miles away. Each lie spoken at a checkpoint bought the Allies precious time. And with D-Day still a distant plan, these fragments of intelligence became bricks in the foundation of liberation. The war they waged was not with rifles or tanks, but with silence, signals, and deception. Their courage lived in whispers, in the rustle of papers slipped beneath floorboards, in the pounding of boots outside their doors, and as the Gestapo's shadow lengthened across Europe. These women stood in its path armed with nothing but their wits, their disguises, and their unshakable resolve. They were spies in plain sight, invisible soldiers whose weapons were lies carefully crafted and whose victories were measured in the lives they saved, the bridges they destroyed, and the secrets they smuggled across enemy lines. The knock at midnight was not just a danger. It was the soundtrack of their war. Britain, 1940. The fall of France had thrown Europe into darkness, and with it came Churchill's command: set Europe ablaze. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, was born in secrecy, tasked with sabotage, espionage, and building resistance networks in Nazi-occupied lands. But the men of Britain were already stretched thin. Soldiers, pilots, sailors, every hand committed to the front. The SOE needed something the Gestapo would not suspect. They needed shadows. Women, overlooked by both their allies and their enemies, became those shadows. Nazi ideology dismissed them as harmless, unfit for serious war. That blindness would become their cover. Recruitment was discreet. Letters summoned candidates to anonymous offices in London. Interviews probed not only courage, but languages, quick wits, and the ability to lie convincingly. A woman with fluent French or German might be invited to a second meeting, then a third. Soon, she would vanish from ordinary life and reappear in the hidden schools of the SOE. In the rolling countryside of southern England, training camps transformed recruits into agents. The lessons were relentless. Wireless operators drilled for hours, learning to tap out Morse code at lightning speed, compressing messages to seconds to evade German radio detection vans. In damp barns, women hunched over practice radios, headphones pressed tight, sending lifelines of information into the night. Explosives training followed. They learned how to wire a bridge with plastique, how to derail trains with a single charge, how to disguise sabotage as an accident. Wooden sheds thundered as practice detonations lit up the countryside. Parachute drills came next. Under cover of darkness, women strapped on harnesses, climbed into lumbering aircraft, and leapt into the cold void. Some landed gracefully. Others limped away from rough falls, bruised and shaken but determined. Each jump prepared them for the moment they would drop into occupied France, their lives hanging on silk canopies. Names emerged from these shadows, women whose courage would become legend. Violette Sabo, barely 22, who had lost her husband in battle and sought vengeance against the Reich. Odette Sansom, a mother of 3, who volunteered despite the risks, later enduring torture and Ravensbrück concentration camp without breaking. Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, hunted by the Gestapo, whose daring escapes and sabotage operations inspired entire resistance networks. Their motivations differed. Grief, patriotism, defiance. But their path was the same. They were to carry war in their pockets, microfilm hidden in stockings, codes memorized under candlelight, pistols slipped into handbags. Yet beneath the glamour of resistance lay brutal preparation. Diaries from recruits revealed exhaustion and doubt. One entry read, "Today we practiced resisting interrogation." They blindfolded me, shouted questions, and struck the table with fists. I answered nothing, but my knees shook. Another wrote of the lesson that haunted them all: torture. Instructors warned of the Gestapo's methods: the beatings, the starvation, the psychological games. Each agent was taught the 24-hour rule. Hold out for 1 day under interrogation, and London might adjust. Networks might scatter. Lives might be saved. Graduation was quiet. No ceremony, no medals, only a handshake and a one-way ticket into darkness. Some boarded aircraft at secret airfields, parachuting into the farmlands of Normandy or the mountains near Lyon. Others slipped onto fishing boats bound for the French coast. From that moment, they were alone, stripped of protection, carrying nothing but forged papers and the weight of nations on their shoulders. The Gestapo did not see them coming. Women moved through occupied Europe with baskets of bread, bicycles, or children in tow. But hidden in those baskets were ciphers. Hidden in those bicycles were maps. Hidden in their quiet eyes were secrets that could shift battle lines. Recruiting shadows was not simply an act of desperation. It was a gamble. That women dismissed as powerless could become some of the most dangerous weapons of the war. And in the ruins of occupied cities, that gamble would prove decisive. By 1942, the Shadow War moved from training fields in Britain into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Under moonlight, heavy bombers crossed the Channel, engines droning as women prepared for the leap. Parachutes were strapped, false papers tucked into coat linings, codes hidden in shoes. Each carried instructions that could never fall into enemy hands. The lifeblood of sabotage networks. With a nod from the dispatch officer, they stepped into the darkness, their descent lit only by tracer fire in the distance. Landing was only the beginning. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, they became ghosts in plain sight. A schoolteacher on her bicycle might, in truth, be ferrying microfilm inside a loaf of bread. A housewife carrying a market basket might hold detonators beneath the eggs. Their disguises turned innocence into a weapon sharper than any blade. Transmission was their most dangerous act. Portable wireless sets, no larger than a suitcase, became their battlefield. In barns, attics, and abandoned apartments, women tapped out intelligence on German troop movements, aircraft shipments, and supply depots. Each signal carried across the channel, guiding Allied bombers, shaping battle plans. But every message was a death sentence if caught. German direction-finding vans prowled the streets, antennae sweeping like predators sniffing for prey. Within minutes, a careless operator could be triangulated. Testimonies record the suffocating tension. One recalled crouching over her set, whispering to herself, 60 seconds, no more. As she finished, boots thundered past outside. She packed the radio into a false-bottom trunk and forced her hands to stop shaking. Railways became another front. These women coordinated sabotage that crippled German logistics. Tracks were blown apart, trains derailed, supply lines severed. Yet they had to move invisibly, their sabotage attributed to accidents or partisan bands. To be discovered meant not trial, but torture in the hands of the Gestapo. Travel was constant, and travel meant risk. They boarded trains under the cold gaze of SS guards, their forged papers scrutinized. Each word, each accent, each gesture had to align perfectly with their invented identities. A misplaced phrase could unravel everything. Some carried cyanide pills, a grim insurance against capture. Nancy Wake, known as the White Mouse, recalled her narrow escapes, slipping past checkpoints with her calm smile concealing fear. Violette Sabo cycled across villages with secret orders pinned beneath her dress, stopping to chat casually with German sentries as though nothing lay at stake. The Gestapo's blind spot was fatal. Nazi ideology dismissed women as incapable of such deception. A young woman with a book or a basket was invisible to them. This arrogance allowed the Allies to exploit one of the greatest deceptions of the war. Yet invisibility came at a price. The double life wore down the soul. Diaries describe the constant strain, the need to laugh convincingly, to play the part of ordinary clerks or widows while carrying secrets that could shift entire divisions. Every knock at the door, every glance from a uniform carried the weight of possible betrayal. Still, their survival meant the resistance could keep breathing. Intelligence guided Allied bombing of factories. Sabotage slowed the German war machine. Messages carried across villages linked partisan bands into coordinated networks. In silence, in disguise, in whispers over radios, they sustained the pulse of defiance across occupied Europe. These women lived entire lives that were not their own, mastering false identities to trick the Gestapo itself. And because they succeeded, the war in the shadows continued. A lifeline of courage stretching from London to the occupied streets of Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam. By late 1943, the game of shadows had turned deadly. The Gestapo, once blind to the scale of Allied infiltration, began to adapt. Radio vans with high-frequency detectors prowled the boulevards of Paris, their antenna rotating, locking onto signals like hounds on a scent. One operator in Lyon barely managed to finish a transmission before hearing the screech of brakes outside. She shoved her set beneath the floorboards, grabbed a basket of laundry, and opened the door with shaking hands. But more often, escape was impossible. Arrests spread like wildfire, safe houses betrayed by informants, networks collapsing under the weight of exposure. Captured women agents were taken to interrogation centers like the notorious Friends prison outside Paris. There, the Gestapo employed methods designed not just to extract information, but to crush the human spirit. Windowless cells, relentless questioning under blinding lamps, and the ever-present footsteps echoing down the corridor. Some women broke, revealing names or locations. Others resisted, their silence speaking louder than any confession. One survivor recalled whispering prayers into the dark, clinging to fragments of memory. A song, a child's laugh, anything to hold on to humanity. Another tapped coded messages through the walls. 3 knocks for yes, 2 for no, passing fragments of hope from cell to cell. Yet even in captivity, deception continued. Women who appeared fragile often proved the strongest. Some feigned ignorance, claiming they were mere couriers with no knowledge of codes or networks. Others deliberately fed false information, sending Gestapo units chasing ghosts across the countryside. Every delay, every misdirection bought the resistance precious time. The consequences of defiance were brutal. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, captured agents were lined up for mock trials that ended in swift executions. Some were hanged, others shot in courtyards, still echoing with the last defiant words of those who refused to betray their comrades. The camp's roll call grounds became a silent graveyard of courage. But even here, resistance endured. A nurse imprisoned for aiding the resistance recalled smuggling scraps of cloth to patch wounds. Another survivor described how prisoners passed along coded scraps of paper, hidden in bread crusts, keeping hope alive even as death loomed. The Gestapo's efficiency was chilling. They unraveled entire webs of resistance, rolling up networks that had taken months to build. Agents once invisible in crowds were dragged into trucks, their false identities stripped away. The tightening net seemed inescapable, and yet their defiance revealed something the Gestapo could never fully extinguish. Diaries smuggled from cells tell of women who sang hymns as they were marched to execution. Testimonies recall whispered vows exchanged between prisoners. Say nothing. They cannot break us. This chapter marks the turning point of the secret war. The Gestapo had grown ruthless, their grip closing on the shadow networks of occupied Europe. But in that darkness, the resilience of these women shone brighter. They had entered the fight underestimated, seen as harmless, incapable of real threat. By late 1943, the Gestapo knew better, and feared them. Even inside prison walls, they continued to trick their captors, sometimes at the cost of their lives. Their courage bought time, space, and survival for those still free. And though many would not live to see liberation, their silence, their lies, and their whispered prayers shaped the fate of the war more than the Gestapo could ever imagine. By early 1944, the war in Europe was approaching its decisive moment. In London, Eisenhower's staff prepared the largest amphibious assault in history. Yet before the Allies could land on the beaches of Normandy, they needed one weapon more subtle than tanks, more powerful than artillery: deception. And in the shadows of that deception stood women, whose names history too often forgets. Networks of female couriers and radio operators became the beating heart of Operation Bodyguard and its countless subplots. They carried fragments of intelligence that, when pieced together by the Gestapo, painted a picture, but a false one. It was a game of calculated truths and crafted lies, and the women were its messengers. In occupied France, a courier mounted her bicycle in the half-light of dawn. Hidden in the frame were codes written on silk, messages that would direct German eyes away from Normandy and toward the Pas de Calais. At checkpoints, she smiled faintly, appearing no more than a schoolteacher on an errand. The Gestapo guards waved her through, never guessing that her papers were forgeries, her satchel the pulse of an invasion. Radio operators risked even more. Each broadcast to London was a deadly gamble. German direction-finding vans could lock onto a signal within minutes. Women set up transmitters in barns, attics, even forest clearings, their trembling fingers tapping out streams of dots and dashes that meant life or death. The moment the message was sent, they packed the equipment into crates and fled, knowing the hounds were already on their trail. Some deceived not by hiding, but by playing double. Women fed carefully prepared misinformation directly to the Gestapo, who believed they were turning Allied agents. Reports of armored divisions massing near Dover, false divisions conjured from rubber tanks and dummy camps, convinced the Germans that the main blow would fall at Calais. The deception worked. Even as Allied troops stormed ashore in Normandy, Hitler held back his panzer reserves, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Testimonies preserved after the war reveal the strain these women endured. One recalled cycling through a rainstorm, her codes soaked and nearly unreadable, terrified that she would be stopped and searched. Another spoke of hiding a transmitter under a loaf of bread, sitting calmly as SS soldiers questioned her, her heart pounding so loudly she thought they could hear it. Yet their courage carried the illusion forward. Every message they delivered, every false trail they laid, every forged paper they presented, added another thread to the web of lies. By June 1944, that web was nearly complete. And then came the dawn of June 6th. As Allied ships loomed off the coast of Normandy, German command hesitated. Reports from their own intelligence, many carried by female hands, still insisted that the main invasion was yet to come at Calais. Hours passed. Divisions waited, and by the time reality pierced the fog of deception, the beaches had been secured. The landings at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword were won by steel and sacrifice. But behind them lay the shadows, the invisible battlefield of whispers, signals, and deceit. The courage of women who tricked the Gestapo was not etched into the sand, but into the very hesitation of the enemy. In the end, their work did not simply support the invasion. It altered its outcome. The web of lies they spun held back the might of the German war machine long enough for the Allies to gain a foothold. Their silent war, waged with bicycles, radios, and forged documents, helped decide the fate of Europe. The Shadow War was never kind, and not all its heroines returned. By late 1943 and into 1944, betrayal spread like a contagion through the occupied territories. A careless word in a cafe, a suspicious neighbor, or the lure of German money could undo months of careful deception. Networks were compromised not by superior intelligence, but by human weakness. The Gestapo thrived on informants, and their reports sent many women into the abyss. One of the most haunting names is Noor Inayat Khan, a British Indian princess turned wireless operator in Paris, codenamed Madeleine. She tapped out messages under constant threat, always moving from safe house to safe house. But betrayal found her. Arrested in October 1943, she endured months of brutal interrogation. Refusing to give her codes, she fought back with silence, misdirection, and sheer resilience. Eventually transported to Dachau, she was executed in September 1944. Her final word, witnesses recalled, was simple: liberté. In that single cry lay both defiance and sacrifice. Others faced Franz prison, the notorious holding ground near Paris. Testimonies describe dank corridors, flickering bulbs, and the echo of screams from unseen rooms. Agents were stripped of cover stories and humanity alike, forced to endure interrogations that blended cruelty with psychology. Some gave false information, buying time for networks still in the field. Others broke under torture, a reminder that heroism was not invulnerability, but endurance pushed beyond human limits. In Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, captured agents joined thousands of political prisoners, starved, Shaved and dressed in striped uniforms, they faced a world designed to erase identity. Yet even here, deception flickered. Some whispered codes into the night, passing scraps of intelligence through fences or tapping messages on cold walls. Survival became its own form of defiance, proof that the Gestapo could not extinguish every spark. One survivor later wrote, "To live was to deny them victory." Her words reflected a truth rarely spoken, that the endurance of even a single agent mattered. Every life carried lessons, every survival a hidden victory that Gestapo records could not quantify. The toll, however, was immense. Broken bones, scarred bodies, and memories that never healed shadowed those who lived past 1945. Liberation did not erase the smell of damp prison cells or the weight of betrayal. Some returned home to quiet anonymity, their service unrecognized, their medals delayed or denied. Others carried silence as their shield, speaking only in diaries or in whispered fragments decades later. The paradox of their fate lingered. For every Noor Inayat Khan, remembered in monuments and posthumous honors, there were dozens whose names faded into footnotes. Yet together, they defined the price of the Shadow War. The deception that saved armies demanded lives in exchange, and it was women who often paid that price. As the Reich crumbled, the survivors walked out of prison gates and camp barracks, emaciated but unbroken. Their eyes had seen both the darkest cruelty and the smallest acts of human kindness. A crust of bread shared, a whispered prayer, a defiant smile before execution. Those fragments of survival became their legacy, a quiet resistance to being erased. This chapter closes with a haunting image. The Gestapo's net may have tightened, but it never fully closed. Through betrayal and survival alike, the women who entered the shadows denied their captors total victory. Their endurance bridged the war's violence with its aftermath, a path scarred by silence, but lit by sacrifice. The gates of the prison creaked open in the spring of 1945. A thin figure stepped into the light, a young woman whose uniform had long since been reduced to rags, whose body bore the scars of interrogations, but whose eyes still held defiance. She carried no rifle, no medals, no flag. Yet in her silence, in her survival, she embodied a war fought not with armies, but with whispers, codes, and deception. The female agents of the Shadow War had tricked the Gestapo with false documents, with double lives, with courage that seemed impossible against such terror. They were wireless operators sending signals under the threat of triangulation. Couriers peddling across occupied France with sabotage instructions hidden in loaves of bread. Women who feigned innocence even as they smuggled intelligence past the very checkpoints of their hunters. Their weapons were radios and false names. Their armor nothing more than the strength to keep lying when capture meant death. And yet, when the war ended, their legacy was bittersweet. While generals paraded in victory and battles like Normandy and Stalingrad filled the pages of history books, the women of the Invisible War faded into obscurity. Their memorials lay not in statues or triumphal arches, but in fragments. A diary with coded phrases, a medal awarded years after their death, or the hesitant voice of a survivor recalling her story decades later. For many, recognition never came. Some returned to families who did not understand what they had endured. Others lived quietly, their silence masking the memories of cells, passwords, and the faces of comrades who never returned. The paradox was sharp. In a war where Nazi ideology dismissed women as weak, it was often women who proved the most elusive adversaries. They slipped through nets the Gestapo believed foolproof. They endured pain intended to shatter the human spirit, and still managed to deceive. They carried identities like masks, shedding them only when the war was won. Their invisible war, though unmarked on maps, had been decisive. They shaped the battlefield not with tanks or bombers, but with the manipulation of belief, by keeping German divisions guessing, by ensuring that whispers of disinformation carried as much weight as artillery. One can imagine Paris on August 25, 1944. Allied troops marched through jubilant crowds, rifles gleaming in the sunlight, liberation announced with banners and song. Somewhere in an attic, a woman sat alone by her radio set. She turned the dial, transmitted her final signal, and switched it off. Her mission was complete, but no one would know her name. While the world celebrated, she disappeared into history's margins, her story nearly forgotten. The legacy of these women is not measured in monuments, but in what they proved possible. They revealed that courage was not defined by strength of arms, but by the ability to endure fear, to deceive an enemy who believed himself invincible, and to keep fighting in silence when recognition might never come. Their war was invisible. Their victory was quiet, but their endurance altered the fate of nations.